chance to get on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say in about, a second we'll be live if you want to start welcoming people now.
Okay.
All right. And I'm going to turn my mic off. So good luck, guys.
All right.
I'll put chat on.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Book Passage Virtually Speaking. And we're really excited about tonight's event for obvious reason. We've got great writers and journalists doing the conversation and a fantastic topic we're all excited about. We'll give it a little more time for people to get in the event and get adjusted, but just wanted to welcome you to the green room. Are we all coming, John and Dan, we're all in the Bay Area right now?
I'm over in Davis.
I'm in Alameda.
Yeah. And yeah, welcome everybody to a more typical January weather.
I know.
Yeah.
Up until a few days ago, it was like, wow, this is weird. We're having like Los Angeles weather or something. But we're cold and wet now.
Yeah, well, there was snow down in Malibu over the weekend. That was something.
Really? Wow.
I know.
That's amazing. Well, and we're not allowed to complain about rain, so.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But snow in Malibu, that's just so bizarre.
Yes, it is.
Welcome. More people are coming in. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we'll give it a couple more minutes for more people to join in, make sure there's no technical issues. For those joining, if you didn't know, Book Passage is still open for actual browsing from 10 o'clock to 5 o'clock every day. And we are also doing curbside for those of you who would rather, feel more comfortable putting your order in online or over the phone and just picking up at our front door. We're happy to do that. We're very accommodating these days. And, but it's so great to have people actually come in, and feels like old times, like less than a year ago.
Seems like forever.
Pre-2020.
Yeah.
Pre-pandemic.
Right.
So, yeah. You've got a nice bookshelf, John.
Actually, this one right behind me, my dad and I built ourselves. It's built in.
Ah, very nice.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Mine is full of Dan's books, so.
That's very nice of you. I got a copy in German
Oh, wow.
and a copy in Italian.
Oh my gosh.
Did that happen right away when they did the first run? They do that?
Yeah,
right
well, it's been published in a bunch of different languages, so these
right.
are the two that I've received so far.
Now, can I order any language I want at Book Passage, or is it English only?
Please, English only. Well, I guess we're officially ready to get started. We've got quite a few people in, and I want to welcome everybody. As always, thank you for supporting Book Passage in any form, in person, virtually, for these events. We've been so appreciative of our audience as we go through this challenging year that has morphed into 2021. I'm Paula Farmer. I'm a book buyer and event host for Book Passage. And as I mentioned earlier, we are now open these days for browsing, but still taking online orders, phone orders, and we're just happy to have people come in. We do appreciate the support for virtual events, and we see the light at the end of the tunnel that we will eventually be back in person and three-dimensional authors, that'll be fabulous. But for right now, we love the worldwide reach, going virtual, pivoting to virtual. So we're not complaining, we're just pivoting and acclimating. We have a very special event tonight. It was just a week ago, maybe a little bit over a week ago, that we saw history being made as Kamala Harris, the first female vice president and first Black and South Asian descent vice president, get sworn in. Before this momentous occasion that brought many of us to tears, tears of both relief and joy of the change, Kamala was on the public stage drawing much attention as a presidential candidate, and before that, a newly elected California senator. And her list of professional accomplishments goes on, and I'm not going to go into that. Our author and his interviewer can do that later. But just as captivating as her professional life is her personal life, and which is what the focus of the book is on, this growing career and her personal character and challenges. This is all wonderfully featured in our book featured tonight, Kamala's Way by Dan Morain. Dan comes to this project as a very experienced journalist, having covered California policy and politics and justice related issues for over 4 decades, including 27 years at the LA Times, 8 at the Sacramento Bee, where he was also the editorial page editor. And helping to shepherd tonight's event is John Diaz. He's also a journalist, and obviously they're friends and colleagues. John has been the San Francisco Chronicle's editorial page editor since 1996. Before joining the opinion pages, he directed the newspaper's East Bay news coverage, and he started out at the Chronicle in 1990 as an assistant city editor. Welcome, both of you, and thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Paula. And it's a real pleasure to be here with Dan. We've been friends for many years. We've also we've been formidable competitors at various points, especially when he was my counterpart at the Sacramento Bee. I just think the world of Dan, and it's great to be here. Dan, let me start by asking you, you had a remarkably quick turn on this book. Why don't you tell the story about how it came to be, with the story that you had in the Washington Post, which then one thing led to another. It's really fascinating. It was a sprint.
Well, yes, it was. I had been freelancing for the past year, for most of 2020. And an editor at the Washington Post wanted a piece about Kamala Harris that would be pegged to the decision by Joe Biden, should he select her as his running mate. And so I wrote that, and it was ready to go on August 11th. And that editor, Michael Duffy, suggested that I write a book about Kamala Harris, and I thanked him. It was a nice thought, and about 2-3 weeks later, he sent me an email saying, you should really write a book about Kamala Harris. And I rethought it and talked to my wife about it, and said, sure, Michael, if you want to call your friend at Simon & Schuster and see if there is interest, by all means. And so that happened. And then separately, an agent by the name of Karen Brailsford was calling her friends because she wanted somebody to write a book about Kamala Harris. And one thing led to another, and she got connected with Scott LaBarre, who's the managing editor of the Sacramento Bee, and Scott suggested me. And so it all came together very quickly, and beginning September, and the deadline was the deadline. It was November 3rd. So I got to work. And that's how it came to be.
So you just had 2 months and change to put together this book. That really is I'm fascinated by the process, Dan. I think in some ways, I would almost compare it to a design, build, construction project, in that, usually, when especially journalists are writing a book, they'll spend a lot of time reporting, and then at some point, after months and months, sometimes years, they'll sit down to write, and they'll have maybe periods where they go through a week or month or months of writer's block, and then they finally get the thing to the finish line. You did this in just over 2 months. How'd you do it? I mean, was it a matter of you would be reporting during the day and writing at night, or how'd you do it?
Yeah, well, it really wasn't over 2 months. It was really 2 months. But it wasn't really 2 months. I mean, as Paula said, I've been writing about California politics and policy for 40 years, and so and based in Sacramento for the LA Times, and then the Sacramento Bee since 1991. So I know, I've known every politician of note who's come through Sacramento in those 30 years, and so Kamala Harris was one of them. I was fortunate that the San Francisco Chronicle covered her really well when she was district attorney and her rise. I read many of the editorials that this guy John Diaz wrote about her as she rose. So part of it was relying on the good work of the Chronicle. San Francisco Weekly did some terrific pieces about her. The LA Times did some terrific pieces. I was also able to impose on a couple of friends. One, Andy Frillo, dear friend we go back to our days at the LA Herald Examiner, helped me with some reporting in San Francisco. A friend from the LA Times, Josh Meyer in Washington, helped me with reporting in Washington. And a terrific student over at Cal, Sasha Hupka, helped me with some research as well, and another researcher and a fact checker. So we, it was a group project. Deadlines are deadlines. You got to meet them, and in order to produce what we produced, it had to be done on the 3rd to be published in January before the inauguration. So that was the goal.
Meeting deadlines, Dan. You sound like a journalist who trained at Humboldt State University, where you and I were at one point classmates and working on the school newspaper.
Yes.
And deadlines were hammered into us in that journalism factory.
Yeah, well, I've had many editors since, John, and they can attest that I missed many deadlines too. So
I don't believe it. I don't believe it, Dan.
So anyway, but yeah, seems like yesterday, Humboldt State, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, I have to ask you, did you think it was a blessing or a curse that you're really the first out of the block with a Kamala Harris biography? We had her, of course, she came out with The Truths We Hold, her basically campaign book, but that was basically, like most presidential candidates, it's almost like essential that they write that book, and it's 30,000 feet with rose-colored glasses. You really didn't have the kind of guideposts, like, for example, if somebody were to embark on a book about President Trump, there are a lot of books which I suspect half the people with a White House credential are doing right now. There's a lot of background that's already been done for them. You had to start from scratch. Was that a positive or a negative?
Well, I suppose ignorance was bliss. I don't know. My goal was to write was to write a fair account of her ascent. And I've been on a presidential campaign trail, and so I know how much you pick up on a campaign trail. And I wasn't on I wasn't following her around in 2019, and certainly not in 2020. except for what I was reading. And in 2019, I was working for calmatters.org, nonprofit here in Sacramento. And so I wrote some items about her, her presidential campaign, such as it was. But I wasn't on the trail. So the goal of this book is to tell readers how this really very impressive woman, very charismatic woman, really smart, really tough, how she got where she came from, how she got from Oakland, where she was born, and Berkeley, where she lived for her first 12 years, to a heartbeat away from the presidency. So it's basic. The reporting cuts off basically on November 3rd, but it's what has led up to that point. And when you think about it, now great biographers are going to be looking at her for years and decades to come. My goal was to tell really, it's Kamala's way in American life, but really it's a California story. It's so interesting how politics in San Francisco shaped her, and how the politics of San Francisco now, in no small way, are helping to shape the nation. I view it as a fascinating California story as much as anything.
It certainly is, Dan, and very well told as well. And I'm just curious, though. I think most authors, when they embark on a book project, and albeit they oftentimes have much more time than you had, have a point of view, have a narrative. You talked about your determination to be fair and help explain the rise. Did you think at some level it was going to be either a flattering book or a critical book? What was your preconception going into it?
Well, I didn't. I didn't think it was going to be a flattering book or a hatchet job. I mean, my goal was not to write a puff piece or a hatchet job. My goal was to write what I knew, what I could prove, what I was told, going in, it's not as if serious investigative journalists and opposition researchers have spent a lot of time picking through Kamala Harris's life. They haven't found very much. I spent a fair amount of time picking through her life, her career. I didn't find very much that is highly negative. Now, you can say that she doesn't take positions, or that she takes questionable positions, but that's politics. She's a politician. It's not as if this is a person who has been transactional. That's not who she is. It's certainly not what I found. So when I went into it, I didn't think that this was going to be a puff piece or a hatchet job. It was going to be fair. It was going to be what I've done for 40 years, which is to sort of write it as I see it, not load it. The one thing that I do think about her, and I thought as I was writing it, if you boil her down to one word, the word that comes to mind is transition. She's a transitional figure. She was born in 1964, a transitional time in the Bay Area, and those years from 64 to 69 were transitional years for America. And she, she was obviously a toddler, an infant, and a little girl during those years, but it was transitional. And then, she was bused. She was bused in Berkeley, where desegregation was a popular issue. People wanted their schools desegregated, and Berkeley was at the forefront of busing for desegregation. And the superintendent who led that effort was a pioneer in school desegregation and a champion of it. So that was a transition. And you think about her running for district attorney in your city, San Francisco. I mean, what a transition that was. She runs to the public library in San Francisco, a great public library, and she copies all the photos of the district attorneys who had come before her, and of course they're all white men, and she's not, and so a transition there. Anyway, transition throughout her life, and in California is going through really interesting transitions along the way, politically, and now I think she's a transitional figure on the national stage. So,
Dan, you write about that district attorney's race in the book, and I obviously I was there as well, following that race and remembering her first editorial board meetings with us. She was running against a longtime incumbent, a huge San Francisco name, Terrence Hallinan, who was very much to the left of her, which I think those on Fox News and others who want to caricature Kamala Harris will be surprised to know she was not the liberal in that race, and that there was Bill Fazio, who was to the right. And it was widely assumed that those two who had run against each other before would be in the runoff, and she found a way to carve the middle between those two so adroitly. You mentioned people's perception of her. The rap against Kamala Harris by those who are skeptical of her is that she's too cautious. But I would say she's been very measured and very strategic, would be the word I would use. And it really started with that race, which you write about in Kamala's way.
right. Well, and I read an editorial in some paper about how that I think the headline was Kamala Harris for Law and Order. You're right. She ran that campaign. She was that person to the left of Hallinan. And I mean, your editorials were I think they helped frame that race, and certainly helped frame the thinking of how I approached writing that chapter. It was it was so interesting. I mean, she came to the Sacramento Bee editorial board multiple times seeking our endorsements. She didn't get it when she ran in 2010 for California Attorney General. I wrote the editorial that supported her opponent.
Extra points, by the way, for disclosing that in the book.
Oh yeah, it's true. I mean, we thought at the Sacramento Bee that Steve Cooley, the LADA, would have been better. It wasn't that we thought she was bad. In fact, we thought she was pretty good, and it was not an easy call, but we ended up endorsing Cooley, but she was always so she was very good at an editorial board. I'm really interested to know how she was at your board. I'm sure she went to the Chronicle board more than she came to the Bees, but she was really good at. She was always very charming. She was really well informed. She was very quick on her feet. She could answer a question, and she was really good at not answering questions. She was not in an offensive way. She just made clear that if you were asking a question that she didn't want to answer, she couldn't answer for whatever reason, she would not answer it. And so I thought that she was interesting, and she was hang on one second. Sorry about that. She was always really adept at appearing before an editorial board. And tell me about what it was like at the Chronicle.
Well, it's interesting, Dan, because I would say I've really seen her evolution in those kinds of situations from when she first started out. She's always been, as you observed, someone who was poised and articulate and engaging. But I would say initially she got too immersed in facts, was too wonky, wanted to tell you
Mhm.
too much about what she knew about a particular question. I think she's gotten much better. And one of the things that I've seen too, particularly on the campaign trail, is in this year, both when she ran for president and then as vice president, she's come across a lot more human. I think she's naturally a guarded person
Mhm.
about her personal life, and she's become much more comfortable than she was early on.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so an interesting politician. So
Well, I'm interested, Dan. One of the things you are very forthright in your book is that you did not have a chance to interview her or her family, who were very immersed in a
right.
certain presidential campaign, vice presidential campaign at the time you were doing the book, and certainly her sister Maya, who's very close to her, was also involved in the campaign. So, given that, in knowing you, I'm sure you tried, but given that, how do you get to the essence of a person for a biography if you can't spend time with them? Obviously, you spent time with her as a journalist, but usually for a biography, you're really looking to get to the essence of the person.
Right.
How did you
Well,
do it? Who did you talk to, and how
well, it
forthcoming?
was. You're right. It would have been so much easier if she had given me some time, but she didn't. She, as soon as uh, I got the assignment to write a book, I sent an email to her campaign, and we and made clear what I was doing. I was going to do it, with their help or not. And she was busy running for, I don't know, vice president. That's kind of so in September and October when I was working on this, she was busy. And obviously the Biden-Harris campaign was very disciplined. They weren't gonna run the risk of talking to me, and so they didn't. They were, polite about it, but it was a firm no. I sent them other emails throughout my reporting. There were facts that I wanted to know. There are things that I really wanted to know that were not particularly, I didn't think, controversial, but by God, they just weren't going to answer. And the same with Maya Harris, her sister. She wasn't going to answer either. It's okay. You go with what you have. And, I talked to people who helped her in her rise politically. Um, her campaign people, her political people, her policy people, as many as I could. I didn't reach them all. There were, if I had another week, I would have reached more. If I had another 2 months, I would have reached more. But I did as much as could be done, and I, certainly relied on the good work of the Chronicle and others. So.
Did you find that those who were friends and close allies of her, were they forthcoming with you, or them knowing how guarded Kamala Harris could be, were they a little reluctant to kind of let her down?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Somewhere. And some people who I know lots about her, just declined. It's understandable. I mean, that happens in journalism. People talk to you or not. People talk to you off the record. People talk to you with the understanding they won't be quoted. All that happened. All of the above here. This is a typical journalism project, right? I adhered obviously to all the rules. What's off the record remains so, will always be so. What was on the record, most of it I used, not all of it. Anyway, just it was, I did read her book, The Truths We Hold. And so I did quote from that, because parts of it, although you're right, it was done through rose-colored glasses. And portrayed her in the most favorable light. It was quotes that presumably she helped write, so, or wrote.
Well, for those who have not been following California politics closely over the years, Dan, you've been really at the top of the game in this state. And I suspect there were some people that your reputation precedes you, which people know you're credible, you've got integrity, but at the same time, you're a no-nonsense reporter. I doubt if you've gotten many Christmas cards from Gray Davis over in recent years, and in some cases, getting a call from Dan Morain is kind of like 60 Minutes on line 2. So I imagine it was probably an asset and a disadvantage that you do have a reputation. And as a journalist, I would say it's a very good reputation. I suspect those who are on the seamier sides of politics are not so welcome to hear from you.
Well, I mean, truthfully, when one of the exercises that I did before writing this was to reread everything I had written about Kamala Harris, most of which was from the SACB, and most of them were opinion columns, and some of them I thought were pretty favorable. Some of them were pretty tough, and so I'm not sure that if you're running for vice president and there's and some journalist is asking you for an interview that necessarily I would be at the top of her list. But
well, tell me about speaking of good Dan Morain stories that I like vis-a-vis Kamala Harris, is when she became Attorney General, you did a little bit of reporting that wasn't so welcome by everyone on Team Kamala.
Yeah, well, yeah, from time to time, such things happen. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, Dan, after doing the research that you did and talking to the many people that you did, how has your perception of Kamala Harris changed as a result of that reporting?
It's interesting. I came into the project thinking, I don't know if it was positive or negative, but I came away with more positive feelings than I left. I mean, I feel like I understand her better. You spend 2 months seriously studying somebody's decisions, talking to people who were involved, who were in the room when she made her decisions. I feel like I have a deeper understanding of her. And then there is this element that I would have had no reason to have known about. She doesn't really talk about it publicly, but she does these acts. These acts of empathy, of compassion, that don't really, they cannot really benefit her. The one that comes to mind most is when she was district attorney. One of her law school friends, a San Francisco lawyer, Matthew Davis, had a neighbor of his who had been a volunteer for Kamala Harris. She was very supportive of District Attorney Harris and delighted that she had won. Anyway, this woman was near to death, and Mr. Davis gave Kamala a call. District Attorney Harris a call asking, wouldn't it be nice if you would write a note to her? She's near the end, and rather than write the note, Harris said, well, what are you doing now? And she got in her car, and Mr. Davis got in his car, and they drove out to Laguna Honda, where this woman was, and she sat with this woman for 20 minutes, holding her hand at the end of her days, and then a couple days later she died. So it was that sort of thing which I ran across multiple times in the course of doing this. It just showed a different side to her, a different facet, and I found it endearing and humanizing, and I think that we're in a really difficult situation in this country, in this state, and I think it matters to have somebody who's got heart at the in power. I think Joe Biden certainly is renowned for his empathy. I think that his second also shares that that impulse is a good thing.
You wrote also in your book about the experience with Tyrone Gale, who was her young communications director, had colon cancer. A lot of us knew him in the journalism field, really dynamic young man who, as he was dying, Kamala Harris got the word and actually dropped everything right before the midterms, like within a couple of midterms, to go at his bedside. I mean, that speaks volumes.
Yeah. So Tyrone Gale, for people who are unaware, was a really very dynamic press secretary. He had been involved, and he had worked his way up from, by age 30, was her first press secretary in the U.S. Senate. But he had also worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016. When she was running for president, he had worked for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. I think that's when I first ran across him. Anyway, he was her press secretary, and I was a columnist at the SACB, and so I had dealings with him from 2017 and 2018. Anyway, he had colon cancer when he was working for Hillary Clinton, and then it was in remission, and then it recurred when he in 2017, he married. He got married to the love of his life, Beth, in May of 2018, if I have the month correct, and then he in October 2018 he was near death, and word came to Kamala Harris that he was dying, and so Harris dropped everything she was doing and got on a shuttle from Washington up to New York to visit him and hold his hand at the end. So it's the sort of thing that she has done repeatedly over the years.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. In fact, I even have my own experience there. As you know, in our jobs, we talk to a lot of politicians. And when my mother died in 2015, there was one that gave me a call, and that was Kamala Harris. And it wasn't a perfunctory call. She went on at some length about the death of her mother, Shamala, who obviously was a prominent part of her life. But the need to talk about it and what it means to lose a mother, I think you're right. It really fits with the Joe Biden model of empathy. It's not just a cliche, and we know how politicians will do things in a very perfunctory way. If they hear that you're about to retire, they'll shoot you a note, but to have like a call at some length, I think speaks a lot about her relationships with people.
Yeah, it does.
Dan, you wrote a piece for us in the San Francisco Chronicle. I think those who are watching, it's a terrific piece in Sunday Insight a few weeks ago. Just Google Dan Morain, San Francisco Chronicle, Kamala Harris, you'll find it. In that piece, you argue that she may well become one of the most consequential vice presidents in history. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, Joe Biden, nobody would think to pick Kamala Harris as vice president to have her be some potted plant. You don't pick Kamala Harris to be vice president to say yes sir. She's her own person. She's smart. She's got opinions. She's going to express them, and so right off the bat, she was going to be a significant vice president. But then, we've got a 50-50 split in the Senate. And so while the Senate, Chuck Schumer will try to avoid 50-50 votes, sooner or later it's going to happen, and Kamala Harris is going to be the person who casts the tie-breaking vote. It's it will happen. Who knows what it will be over? It could be over a nominee for a judicial position, or it could be one of his cabinet selections who Republicans want to try to tube. And it could be over some significant piece of legislation. Who knows what it's going to be over? But when it happens, she's going to be in a especially prominent place. Symbolically, it's significant. I mean, to have a woman in that position, to have a woman of color in that position, I think is the symbolism is deep. But it's not. I mean, this is what she is. Who she is a really smart, talented, accomplished person, and I think she'll have an impact on policy in ways that maybe some vice presidents didn't have. Obviously, Dick Cheney was hugely consequential, and Al Gore was consequential. She will be significant.
Wasn't Dick Cheney president? No, just kidding, Dan. You and I have been around political consultants and strategists enough to. How many times have you heard the phrase as the press is doing a lot of speculation and the run up to the selection of a vice president, where someone will say, well, no, people do not vote on the vice president. But we've also seen over the years that although I would be hard pressed to pick a vice president who actually significantly helped somebody get elected, there certainly are vice presidential candidates who have hurt candidates in a big way. Thomas Eagleton with George McGovern being the most dramatic example, but Geraldine Ferraro probably hurt Mondale, although he was probably destined to lose that candidacy anyway. But then you think about Sarah Palin. As I look back at the 2020 election, I thought as a vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris was almost flawless.
Yeah, she doesn't. She's a very good campaigner. Now, her presidential campaign was a dud. It never took off. It started out great in Oakland, the incredible rally. The crowd was amazing. So she came on really strong, but then from there it was all downhill. She could never really figure out what her lane was, and she obviously could never nick into. She could never take a bite out of Joe Biden's support in South Carolina. So her candidacy for the president just never took off. But you're right. As a vice president, again, I wasn't on the campaign trail, but from everything I've read and from people I've spoken with, she was really good. She added an element of energy and youth, and the scene of her in October in Florida dancing in the rain with her umbrella. I mean, that was pretty priceless. Kind of hard to imagine Mike Pence doing that. So I don't, I think people voted for Joe Biden. I don't think they voted for Kamala Harris, but she certainly didn't hurt him. And I do think that she obviously there was a big fundraising bump, and it after she joined the ticket, she's again, she's consequential. She is somebody to not, you underestimate Kamala Harris at your own peril, as opponents have found.
Dan, let's not talk about the imagery of Mike Pence dancing in the rain with an umbrella. We're going to give our audience nightmares tonight. You mentioned, let's go back to her presidential campaign for a second, because it was very interesting the way she came out so strongly. She had some moments, including that first presidential debate with Joe Biden, where she talked about busing and that little girl was me. you mentioned that she couldn't choose a lane, and I would agree with your analysis that that's really what sunk her. The progressives didn't really buy into her, particularly with her prosecutorial background. A lot of people presume that she was kind of a closet radical. Uh, is there a lane that you think could have, if not won the nomination, at least carried her further than she went? Because she was out before the Iowa caucuses.
Yeah, no, because she couldn't unseat Biden. She couldn't. You know, the whole point of the attack in that first debate, where she went after him for over school desegregation, his stand on busing for school desegregation. The whole point was to attack him in a way that would weaken his support in South Carolina, and it just didn't work. He was solid with a core group of voters who she needed, and she never got there. And she had trouble with single payer healthcare for all. She was for it, and then she wasn't for it. She was late to an event in Iowa. There, she had missteps, but Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren had the left locked up, and Biden was the center left candidate. And I think he was always the front runner, and nobody else really was. I mean, I suppose maybe at some point Bernie Sanders could have derailed him, but no. It was Biden. Voters concluded that Biden was the one who would beat Trump, and that's who they voted for. I think. I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting premise. I would disagree with you to this extent, Dan. It seemed to me that Biden was really fading out, and then it looked like Bernie Sanders was going to get the nomination. Mm-hmm. And the party establishment all but panicked, like, we can't have Bernie as the nominee. He would be a likely loser, and I would agree with that analysis. So they turned to Biden. Of course, Congressman Clyburn in South Carolina had a lot to do with it.
Right.
I mean, I have my theory is that if Kamala Harris had early on staked herself as the center left alternative and not been over the map, or one of her early problems during the campaign was she'd be asked a tough question and her answer would be, she'd hit the button and the record button and say, we need to have that conversation. Instead of where she stood. And Pete Buttigieg, obviously another center candidate, but at the same time, I think it's quite a leap from mayor of South Bend, Indiana to the presidency. But be that as it may, it was a missed opportunity, but I suspect she's going to have more opportunities down the line.
No doubt. Well, and that all depends on Joe Biden's success, his success as president. And if he's a successful president, then her chance of succeeding him is much greater. I think but who knows? I mean, she entered the presidential race understanding that it was a very long shot. If her chance was 10% of getting the nomination, she was willing to take that risk, which gets back to the question of is she a cautious politician? Well, that was a pretty bold move to jump in to the presidential race after you've been in the U.S. Senate for 2 years. I think she had to do it politically. She had to do it. She had a good theory of how she could win. And she would have been a formidable general election candidate. I do think, though, that Biden was the one person who could have beaten Trump, and did.
I really liked in your book where you write about the little meeting in New York City where some of her aides and closest advisors got together, and should she or should she not run for president? That was very revealing.
Yeah. Well, they called it the thing. The superstition runs deep in politics, as you know. So they never talked about the president. Should she run for president? It was also should she do the thing? I kind of like that.
Dan, this is quite a time right now for politicians who got their start in San Francisco. We have Governor Gavin Newsom, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein is the senior senator from California, whose politics were once dominated by Southern Cal. And of course, now the Vice President of the United States. You look back, we had Willie Brown, we had John Burton, we had the great Phil Burton as a member of Congress. Do you think that San Francisco pedigree had a great deal of influence on her? And what is it about San Francisco? I'm interested in your standpoint from somebody who has looked from a California perspective. What is it about San Francisco that produces these great leaders?
Well, you know, it is interesting, and kind of all goes back to Phil Burton and his brother John. And the you know, Willie Brown would not have happened without Phil Burton's support and his friendship with John. But then he goes off to become you know, obviously Willie Brown becomes a hugely consequential figure in California politics and San Francisco's politics. Well, it's a tough town. I mean, it is the politics in San Francisco are really quite bare knuckled. I mean, it was my experience when I worked there, watching these people fight on the Board of Supervisors. You know more about it than I do. But I see them in Sacramento. The politicians who come from San Francisco, by and large, are really good at just the basics of politics in ways that LA politicians just are not. And maybe it's because San Francisco is more of a retail politics city. They're just adept at handling the press, at getting their bills through, at becoming the chair of the budget committee or whatever it is, right? They are truly a cut above. The ones who emerge do really well. So.
You know, there's a couple of factors there too, Dan. One, you would be surprised. Everyone that I've mentioned would be considered a leftist nationally, but is considered a moderate in San Francisco, whether it's Pelosi or Feinstein or Gavin Newsom or Kamala. We're not considered particularly liberal in San Francisco. The other thing that you need to do in San Francisco is, even though the politics is very progressive, there's a lot of money in San Francisco. And if you want to succeed, because those races are so competitive, you have to raise money. So you have to know how to work that class as well. Mm-hmm. And everyone that I mentioned does it quite well.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about Kamala Harris, much has been said about, and I write about her friendship with Willie Brown. But her first fundraising chairman was Mark Buell, and in that basically 6 weeks in 2002, when she decided she was going to run, and until the end of that year, she raised $100,000. It's a huge amount at $500 a pop, right? So, and then she raised $1 million in that first race against Terry Hallinan. As a relative unknown. I mean, she was known in certain circles, society circles, political elite circles, but the voters of San Francisco certainly didn't know who Kamala Harris was in 2003. It's really an extraordinary rise. I mean, you think about this time, 17 years ago? She was the newly sworn in district attorney of San Francisco, and now look where she is. It's extraordinary.
And I have to ask you, what was going through your mind on election night? Now, I know there's no rooting in the press box, and you're an objective journalist, but at the same time, let's face it, there's a huge difference in sales of this book, which is terrific and I recommend, but far more people are going to see it now that we have this groundbreaking vice president than if we were looking at a second Trump-Pence administration.
Yeah, well,
what were you thinking on election night? What was it like in the Morain household?
well, I'll tell you, John. I handed in the last few chapters at about, I don't know, 6:30, 7 o'clock on November 3rd. And I went downstairs and I turned on the election returns and I had a Manhattan. And I watched the returns and I had another Manhattan, and it was about 10 o'clock. And I thought, well, I could continue watching this or I could have a third Manhattan. It is never a good idea to have a third Manhattan. So I went to bed. But the reality is that she was going to be around either way, win or lose. What I got paid was not dependent on her victory, on Biden's victory. You're right. I have always aspired to be a fair journalist, even as an editorial page editor and opinion writer. That said, I think I'm just glad Trump didn't win another 4 years. I just think it would have been disastrous. So regardless, aside from Kamala's way, I'm glad it turned out the way it did.
Do you think she runs?
And I think that the final 2 months of the Trump administration bore that out.
Oh my gosh. That will be a subject of many books, I suspect, and locked into history books. Let me ask you, Dan, do you think Kamala Harris runs for president in 2024, that Joe Biden will really be looking to serve one term?
Well, yeah, I don't know Joe Biden. I met him once in 2007 in Des Moines. I'm sure he doesn't remember me. But this is a man who has wanted to be president for a really long time. I understand the conventional wisdom is he's 78, he'd be 82 in 4 years. Can't imagine that he would run for president, the hardest job in the world, at age 82. That said, if his health is fine, I don't see why he wouldn't. I mean, I truly don't. He has said he's a bridge to the next generation. She clearly is the face of the next generation. She is that transitional figure in American politics. So yeah, of course, if he doesn't run in 2024, of course she will run. If he doesn't run in 2028, of course she'll run. Whether she gets the nomination is another question. I mean, these are hard jobs. We've only had 46 presidents. If she gets the nomination, does she win? The Electoral College is still stacked against Democrats and 4 Republicans. So I think it's hard to get from where she is to that next step. It's a long way up.
And if you look at history, particularly in modern times, the person who is presumed to be the front runner tends to not go the length. So yeah, you're right. I mean, no question. She will be considered the likely heir apparent, but you never know.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Dan, I have a final question. You did a terrific job on a compressed timeline for Kamala's Way. All kinds of really good insights in there. Do you now have the bug to write books? What's next for Dan Morain?
Oh, I don't know. There is a really interesting story to be told about that goes beyond Kamala Harris, and it's a San Francisco story. I mean, how Phil Burton shaped San Francisco politics. A friend of ours, I think you would have known him, John Jacobs, wrote a great book about Philip Burton. I think that there's a sequel to be written about that.
Yeah, and particularly if Kamala Harris continues to rise, I think that will be a subject of much study.
Mhm.
So we will look forward to that book, Dan, not to put pressure on you.
Well,
You're
maybe you and I can work on it together, John. You've
Well,
lived it.
that sounds great. And give us more than 2 months to do it. A great feat. And Dan, it's so great to see you. And
Great to
we'll
see
throw
you.
it back to Paula. Thank you to Book Passage. Everybody go out there and buy Kamala's Way. I'm somebody who has been following her for over 20 years, and there were plenty of things I learned in there, which I think is the ultimate compliment to author Dan Morain.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much, John. Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, thank you to the both of you. I think from the book reading, I haven't finished it, but I have read part of it, and from reading it and then your conversation, you feel like you know somebody because you see them so much for the last 2 or 4 years, and you hear reporters say so many different things. But I really felt from your discussion and from reading parts of the book that more of a humanity about her. That just, other than her smile, that's very bright and infectious, you want to know that that's authentic. Kind of behind that smile, there's an authenticity, and that's what I got from your discussion. And from here, there's this other part of her that's beyond what we're seeing in the news or the campaigns, and that's so interesting. And she's only going to get more interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Love her or like her, vote for her or don't vote for her, she's still going to be very much in the limelight, and only get more and more interesting, personally and professionally. But thank you so much for writing it quickly, getting it to Book Passage and all the other bookstores. And thank you for this discussion. We do have plenty of copies of Kamala's Way at Book Passage, and we have signed books, book plates, and we're going to get more. So for every book that's sold, you'll get a signed copy from Dan. So we really appreciate that. Thank you, audience, for coming. We have a good showing tonight. It shows the interest in your writing, in your career, Dan and John, and also in the figure topic of your book. So thank you everybody for showing up. Until next time, have a good evening and be safe.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks again, Paula. Thanks, John. See ya.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Dan.